All right, TBD Podcast, welcome everybody to another week. Today we have former state senator Jeff Brandes. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, great to be with you. Thanks.
So we were just talking criminal justice reform in Florida, and you were mentioning that there was a study done. These people said, hey, we need $2 billion plus spent immediately, but the Florida Legislature would only provide, what, $100 million?
Yeah, they provided $100 million.
Why the discrepancy?
Well, because they obviously weren't prepared for that number. They hadn't allocated that really in their budget, even in their mindset yet. And they're still trying to wrap their head around kind of what the larger vision is for the Florida prison system, you know. And again, we can jump right in. Like my big takeaway after 12 years in Tallahassee is everything in Tallahassee is tactical. There is no strategy, right? The big issues of Florida do not have a strategic vision that goes along with them. And the reason, and part of that is a structural problem Florida has really constitutionally. You know, we have 8-year term limits, and our speaker and our Senate president are really only in that office for 24 months. And so think about any large organization where the CEO changes out every 24 months. It would be somewhat schizophrenic. Mm-hmm. And this is the challenge Florida has. Speakers come in, Senate presidents come in, they have different priorities than their predecessor.
Right.
I've seen one Senate president completely undo the former the previous Senate president's major initiatives in the first year. You know, somebody works for 2 years on the idea. The next guy comes in and pulls it out in the next year.
And you were both a representative and a state senator.
Yeah,
correct?
so I was in the Florida House for 2
saw
years.
both of those sides.
And I was in the Florida Senate for a decade.
And what do other states do it differently?
Yeah, some states don't have term limits. I think 8-year term limits are probably too short. You know, it's just too little time to learn about the complexities of the state. I'm a fan of term limits. I would not be in office except for term limits because about 80-85% of your incumbents are going to get reelected, and so term limits are kind of like the ultimate refresh on politics, and they're the kind of fail-safe mechanism that we've built into the political system that brings in new ideas and gets people that are maybe there for the wrong reasons out of the process without. And I think that's appropriate. I think it's necessary. I do think 8-year term limits in Florida are too short, and I would support a 12-year term limit. But I think more so than term limits, the fact that we're turning over leadership so often is what is driving Florida to this tactical mentality and not letting us deal with some of these strategic issues.
I mean, by the time you even understand how the process works, how to get things done, you're already on your way out. It doesn't really make sense.
Well, that's it. I mean, look, Florida is radically more complicated today than it was, 50, 60 years ago when a lot of these systems were put in place.
Right.
And, when you think about, I'm going to be dealing with, when you're a legislator, you're going to walk in the door, you're going to deal with education policy, environmental policy, agricultural policy, transportation, housing, criminal justice. I mean, the world of policy that you have to learn. In the first 2 years, you're just trying to figure out, like, how do I file a bill and where are the bathrooms?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Like, how do I get around this building and get to my committees without looking like a total idiot and being lost? And it takes you really years to learn one area of policy. And my kind of big advice to legislators who would come see me as I was a senior senator and they're just kind of entering the process is like, what do I focus on? And my counsel to them was like, find one thing that you're passionate about and spend the next 3 or 4 years almost exclusively on that one big idea.
So we're talking about updating the state's constitution, right?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately that's probably something that I would support in looking at that. But I think there are other fixes that you could do that wouldn't require us to update the state constitution. For example, the incoming Senate president and speaker, they take over in November of after the election, but they could take over right after session ended, which is March or April. And I think that would help with some at least strategic planning that they do.
Kind of like the president, right? Elected in November, and then there's a change of hands in January.
Correct. So I think there's some things we could do without, but that's kind of more of the technical process piece. Ultimately, Florida is the third largest state in the country. It is growing exponentially. We have 23 million people in Florida today. We will likely have 28 million people within a decade in Florida. That's a growth of, close to 25% over the next 10 years as baby boomers retire and as other states' tax policies are not as favorable as Florida's is.
Yeah.
People are moving away from high tax states to lower tax states, and baby boomers are moving and transitioning to Florida because this is where they've always dreamed of ending up.
Yeah, every statistic, every trend, every migration pattern points to that fact. And it's kind of a scary fact too.
Right.
I mean, I think when I was born in 92, I'm 32 years old. I think there was like, I don't know, Tyler could probably look it up, maybe 15 million, 18 million, something like that. So just in my short lifetime, we've had an insane millions of people have moved to Florida.
Right.
And it's palpable, right? Like you drive on the roadways. I've noticed it growing up here in Florida. The drive from Tampa to Sarasota, it used to be all pastures and now it's all homes and every road is full. And to imagine the same geographical area, right? We're a peninsula. To imagine the state we have with, what did you say, 5 more million people
Correct.
in the next few years.
Well, and it's not just the people that are permanent residents. It's also that you're dealing with 150 million tourists now.
Right. The most visited state, right? Correct, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I believe had a record number of visitors in the last few years.
Right. So you have, between 130 and 150 million people visiting Florida every year on top of the other growth that we're already seeing. So, we have real strategic issues we've got to get our arms around in transportation and housing, in property insurance, in criminal justice, as we've started talking about. That's really why when I left the legislature, I started the Florida Policy Project. Having this kind of takeaway that everything in Tallahassee is tactical and not strategic. How do we deal with that if that's the paradigm that we have to exist in? And so the Florida Policy Project really says, all right, well, there's probably nationwide best practices. If we can adopt this idea that our strategy should be to move to whatever the best practice is amongst the country. And so, but where do you even go to find those best practices? And so the Florida Policy Project was born out of this idea that we don't even know what the best practices are. There's not a simple place to go find them. No think tank. I like to think of ourselves as a do tank more than thinking, but no think tank really focuses just on best practice research. And so we created a Tampa Bay based, best practice focused think tank / do tank. That just focuses on 4 public policy areas: criminal justice, property insurance, transportation, and housing. And just looking at, let's create a baseline of where we believe Florida is today, and then let's look at best practices that could get us to the next level.
Yeah, it seems like politics gets in the way of so much, right? And at a national level, you really see this. There's so much fighting on either side of the aisle. And nothing gets done because of it. There's always these disagreements. And with disagreements come, I think, time, right? When you have a disagreement, well, now we have to solve for that disagreement. Now we're talking about however long it would take to solve that issue. At the state level, what did you experience? Do people get along a little better than they seem?
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, my best friend was Jason Pizza, who's the incoming Democratic leader. We roomed together our last 3 years. We had a blast, and we got along. We're still best friends. So it's it's a very different dynamic in Tallahassee when it comes to legislators. In DC, most legislators don't talk to each other. In Tallahassee, you don't have that option. You're going to be serving with these folks for years. You need to build relationships. There's only going to be 40 of you in the Senate, 120 people in the House, and you have to work on helping each other and trying to try to understand the other person's perspective as well.
Yeah.
But understand, unlike DC, in Tallahassee, probably 85 to 90% of all bills are passed unanimously.
Wow.
And so it's a very, you hear about the contentious
That's so encouraging to hear as a Floridian.
Well, it is. As long as
granted, we have our issues,
right,
of course.
Right. As long as you're focusing on the right things. Unfortunately, a lot of times the things that we're unanimously voting on, may not be the best practice or may not be anywhere near that. And we may not be taking on the big issues because either nobody proposed them or the leadership didn't let that go to the floor vote. So, while you can say it's unanimous, if you're voting on, what we're going to name the state bird, that doesn't really mean meaningful impact as much as how we're going to deal with this insurance crisis where Floridians are paying 3 or 4 times the national average and your kids can't afford to live in your community.
Yeah. Those issues you spoke of, those 4 issues, there's ideology at play, right? And there is a difference of opinion, especially, let's just say, criminal justice reform.
Sure,
we
absolutely.
talked about that in the beginning, right? So whether you're talking about the death penalty, moral issues like that, how does that come together? I mean, that's a tricky bridge to cross, right? Because some people believe that an eye for an eye, and some people believe that the government should never take life.
Well, and understand this, most legislators have never had to think about it.
Mm.
They have no concept. They have no perspective. Many of them don't even know people who've ever been to prison.
So education sounds like is the
so-
first thing you can do.
Yeah. So, one of the things that you can do as a legislator and is to take your state ID, your legislative state ID, and you can go to any prison day or night, walk up to the front door, show them your ID, and get a tour of that facility right then. I've done it at 10 a.m. I've done it at 2 a.m.
Wow.
And most legislators don't take advantage of that. That most legislators have never toured prisons. But what you see when you do that is how people live. Like, recognizing that, it's 75% of Florida's prisons are not air conditioned. That 75%, yeah, of Florida's prison facilities are not air conditioned, right? So, we all get the pleasure of going from air conditioned space to our car to another air conditioned space. But it's oppressive when you walk into a prison dorm and the heat on the outside is less than the heat on the inside, and you feel that wave of heat and humidity hit you. And people are, and then you realize, well, the yard that people are exercising on has no trees, because trees and branches can become weapons. And so they've taken down all the trees, and there's not a lot of shade. And so, those are kind of the things that you see only if you experience it. I used to only take legislators. I used to always invite other legislators to come with me, and I would always take them in the heat of the summer. And they'd say, well, why are you, it's really hot. Can we go another time? I'm like, no, the point is for you to see it when it's hot, for you to experience it. But you also find most judges have never been to a prison. Most state attorneys have never been to a prison. Most public defenders, and many of them have never been to a prison facility. So it's hard for people to wrap their arms around them.
Ignorance is bliss.
Well, people just want them to go away and
Yeah.
get fixed. And what they don't recognize is we don't have a Department of Corrections. We have a Department of Warehousing.
It's so obvious, though, that the mental health and the rehabilitation of criminals is clearly a better path than what the country's been doing for the past few decades. These repeat offenders, if you look at any school shooter or some of these mass shooting incidents, some of these high-level crimes, if you look back at their history, they were always offenders. They've always had FBI tips going on, all that sort of stuff. It seems like the mental health, it seems like instead of throwing people in jail with no air conditioning, there's got to be a better way to solve for that.
So I like to think of inmates in two categories. There's the people that we're scared of, and then there's the people that we're mad at. And how are we treating the people that we're scared of? Like, we're perfectly fine separating those people from society.
Right.
But the people that we're mad at, we should be able to find a way to reintegrate them.
And there's a lot of those
people.
There's
a lot of those people.
There's a lot of those people.
But Florida over the decades has implemented things like, Florida doesn't effectively have parole anymore. We still have parole committee, and people still get out on parole. But get this, those are people that were incarcerated prior to 1983. After the mid-'80s, we ended parole in Florida. And so the only people that are getting out on parole in Florida are those that were incarcerated prior to 1983. And so we still have, 10, 15 people a year that get technically out on parole, maybe a few more that get out on parole, but a vast majority of people, there is no parole option for them in Florida. And I think that's a challenge that Florida deals with, because, parole, the opportunity there is to transition them in an orderly fashion back into society.
Right.
Florida's transition program is $50 in a bus pass. Right? We're going to hand you $50 on your way out. We're going to give you a bus pass. Go with peace. There isn't transition services. There is nobody following up, and this is why people end up in bridges or end up homeless, because they run out of $50 in 2 days, and they have no place to go.
They have no opportunity.
That's right.
For their life to be any different.
Sure.
Is it because Florida's mostly a privatized prison state?
No,
why
it's
is this
actually
happening?
not. We only have we have about 53 major facilities in Florida. Only 6 or 7 of them are private facilities.
Oh, wow. So
And
that's got to be a lot lower than the rest of the country, right?
Yeah, well, it probably there are private facilities in many states. Both state and federal facilities are privatized. But if you go to prison in Florida, you're going to beg to go to a private prison, because the private prisons are largely air conditioned. Those are the air conditioned facilities that we do have, is the privates, because they're newer. They were built with private dollars, and the privates know that they're not be able to attract corrections officers that want to work in these other in non-air conditioned facilities. So the new ones are largely the air conditioned ones, and those are all privates.
This ties into growth so well, because when you have 5 more million people coming here in the next 8 years, of course you're going to have criminals, right?
Yeah,
The more people you have naturally, the more crimes are going to be committed.
well, yeah.
It just seems like our state grew so quickly that, and we've always been playing catch up. I've just seen this growing up, whether it's a roadway, fixing potholes, infrastructure issues. Our current mayor here in Tampa has done a good job of kind of going back and fixing a lot of underground piping and stormwater issues and stuff like that. She's kind of made that a priority of hers, which is nice. But can you ever get ahead is the question. Can you get ahead on prison reform?
This is the challenge we're seeing in every area of public policy, right? And this is the problem of running a state on tactics and not strategy. You never get ahead. Yes, our infrastructure all needs to be, it's all 50 years old, right? We still have lead pipes. We still have, old
ceramic
systems.
pipes,
right,
even older.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody wants to build, but nobody wants to maintain, right? So everybody wants to go out and build that new shiny thing, but nobody wants to say, all right, now we need to spend $200 million on infrastructure in order to keep these, in order to keep this stuff up.
Not sexy.
It's not sexy. It's the stuff that people don't see that and politicians don't get credit for. They want to get credit for something that they're spending money on.
Exactly.
But it's so necessary that we make those infrastructure investments. And it's a challenge because it's hard to kind of get those approved through the budget when there's other shiny toys that people want to buy.
On criminal justice reform, is there a particular state or municipality that you visited where you go, wow, they've really done a good job. They're doing it the right way?
Unfortunately, almost every state is dealing with some level of what Florida's challenges are. The federal prison system is not the place you want to look. They have their own huge set of challenges. Everybody's facing correction officer shortages. I mean, good luck getting a millennial to go into the corrections facilities because you got to put your cell phone in a locker for 12 hours and you can't access it, and how many of them want to work in unair conditioned space?
Right.
And so that's been a real challenge for Florida. And in fact, we have, 300, almost 400 members of the Florida National Guard on permanent duty that are at corrections facilities right now because we can't hire enough corrections officers. 2 years ago, the last time I was looking at the numbers, about 40% of our corrections officers quit within their first year and 60% quit within 2 years. And I would imagine many of your listeners couldn't tell you where the closest prison facility is to Tampa Bay. It's likely Zephyr Hills, which is, as we were discussing earlier, it's essentially the elderly facility of Florida is Zephyr Hills. But most of the people, if you commit a crime in Tampa Bay and you're going to end up in prison, you're largely going to serve that in the Panhandle because that's where, the Florida prisons were set up as rural jobs programs back in the 60s and 70s. And, and there aren't hotels. You're not going to get visitation as much. There's a lot of evidence that says, if we can house people closer to their families, they're going to get more family interaction, which is long-term positive for that individual and for those families and for those kids down the road.
Absolutely.
And so, Florida just hasn't set up its system that way. And while we can call that a best practice all day long, it's going to take real resources and somebody who's willing to step up and championing that issue in Tallahassee. Well, there's the challenge. It's like nobody gets elected to fix the prison system in Florida.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody talks about insurance, housing, the transportation. Those are the major issues. The economy, right, as the major issues of the state. But there are other things. Only the government can imprison people in Florida, and somebody's got to fix this thing.
COVID was such a distraction. It was such a distraction from the real issues at play. The entire national conversation, and especially at a state level, because our governor was very opposing to a lot of the other policies, right? That's all the conversation was about. And so this prison talk wasn't even on the list.
Well, prison talk in Florida hasn't been on the list for 20 years.
Now, so back to that statistic you said, the 60% of guards, was it 60%?
Yeah, 40% within 1 year and 60% within 2 of their hire date.
Those guards leaving, do they quote working conditions? Like, why are they leaving?
Yeah, the schedule, working conditions.
No air conditioning, you mentioned.
No air conditioning. The Amazon fulfillment center has opened up, and they're going to pay me $25 an hour. I'm going to go there, right? So pay is a big issue. There's a variety of issues that just stress.
Right.
I mean, when you
it's
don't
a tough
have
job.
When you don't have enough corrections officers, we basically run our state facilities on a skeleton crew all the time. Like imagine a hurricane was coming to Florida and we're like, all right, we got to pull everything back, send people home. We're going to run a skeleton crew. That's how we operate these facilities day in and day out. So oftentimes people get held over on shifts. So, you thought, you've got a birthday party you got to be at 8:00, but now your supervisors come to you and said, hey, listen, we need you to work a double today. Well, if that happens one time, you're okay. But if it happens every single day, and instead of that 8-hour shift, you're working 12 or 16 hours. Oh, and we need you to come in tomorrow because somebody else quit, or we don't have enough staff coverage, and if you don't come in, we're going to write you up. Like that is the world corrections facility officers live in Florida. And that's what is so frustrating and why so many transition. I mean, then that's why, sheriff's offices poach and police departments poach from corrections officer facilities, but people are just ready to transition out. And it's just such a very demanding and challenging job for them.
I'm not too privy to this issue. You're kind of blowing my mind, really, in a bad way. This is really horrible to hear. One thing I have heard consistently over the years is the privatization of prisons. That's the issue. The private corporations owning the prisons is the issue. The fact you said about most of the prisons in Florida are not private.
No,
they're owned by the government.
For a handful.
Which I guess is a good thing, right? Because then we have control over it. We can make changes, right? We can fix it. If it was private, maybe it's a little harder to fix.
No, I don't think it's harder to fix. I mean, look, your prisons are going to be built by private individuals, right? We don't have state construction crews building them. They're going to be maintained like we don't have a state plumber that maintains the facilities. The food's going to be provided by a food service company. That's not a state facility. I mean, who do we really want? What do we consider public versus private? It's the corrections officers. Like who is actually in the facilities? That's really the only determination of what is public and what is private. Everything else we expect to be private.
Well, it's kind of a classic story in America where private corporations usually do it better than government in terms of more efficient, in terms of more quality. It sounds like
you don't want the state providing healthcare to inmates.
Exactly. Exactly. But in the same way, right? It sounds like privatization might be an answer.
Well, it could be an answer. The studies really show that there really isn't a cost savings of public and private facilities. That's kind of a myth, right? That's going to be cheaper if we go private. That just isn't the case, right? They're paying the prevailing wage. They've got to provide healthcare services. They've got to provide food services. All of those things have to be done. The real challenge Florida faces is we don't have a vision for what we want our prison system to look like. We don't have a plan because we have 83,000 inmates today, and we will have 100,000 inmates in a decade, and we have no place to put them. And we don't have enough people we don't have enough corrections officers to staff them. And so we're, as a state, going to have to think about this problem in a different way because we aren't ready to solve for X.
How far along is the Florida Policy Project in the creation of at least some sort of an agenda or a plan that you could put in place?
So KPMG came out with a plan a year ago. So a year ago, that basically said the state needs to spend about $12.5 billion over the next 20 years on its corrections system. But they said you need to spend $2.2 billion of that immediately. And we spent $100 million.
So it's a funding issue.
It's more than a funding issue. It's a vision issue. It is a strategy issue. We don't have a strategy, and we don't have a strategy in housing, and we don't have a strategy in property insurance. And transportation is probably the area that we have the most strategy, but that requires a huge amount of funding at a time when the gas tax is actually starting to, look at declining because cars are getting much more fuel efficient. You've got electric vehicles coming on the roads. And so it's a whole set of challenges financially at the federal and state level of how you're going to fund these roads and infrastructure. I mean, we see this every day in Tampa Bay.
And $2.2 billion would, of course, include, air conditioning systems, hiring more officers, et cetera. Every issue we've talked about.
Fixing roofs that still have tarps on them that are leaking every day on top in cells.
It's that bad.
Yeah, it's that bad.
What is it like when you show up at 2 a.m. to a prison?
After the initial shock of, I'm about to have to take somebody around here, it's actually, thank you. It's actually this, oh my gosh, you care, right?
Yeah.
Like I have never seen somebody, I've never met some of these prisons that I would go to, they had never seen a legislator, period.
Wow.
And some of them, and you get these honest conversations about what's going on in the prison facilities. You get the honest conversations of, yeah, we have an education facility at the prison, but it's got mold and we can't use it, so we haven't used it in the last 5 years. Or we don't have a teacher on staff. We have 1,500 inmates, but we have 0 educators on staff. And so you go, what do these guys do all day? And they're like, nothing. I mean, you can only mow the grass so many times at a prison.
Right.
So there is a lot of work to be done. We need champions in the prison system, and it's by far the hardest area of public policy to work on in Florida.
I'm sure you found passionate individuals that are in charge of some of these prisons, whether it's like regionally or individually, that are trying to get you and other people to advocate for funding and whatever they need. Are they being met? What are they being met with at the state level currently?
They're being met with, we don't have the money for that, or we don't want to spend the money on that. Right.
Is it a conservative thing? Is it a no, that means more taxes, so we won't do it?
I actually think criminal justice reform is a conservative issue.
Okay.
Because I don't care how you get there, whether it's kind of social justice issues or we're spending money and getting terrible outcomes based on the money that we're spending.
Right.
Or just generally, this is not how we should treat other human beings. Yet they're still American citizens. They still have a right. No law enforcement official can tell you your son or daughter is going to go to prison because they committed a crime, and that's what they've been adjudicated, that they're going to be safe. Like, we can't tell you that they're going to be safe when they enter the prison gate, the prison gates. We don't know what's going to happen to them. We don't have the staff and manpower to protect them. And that is, to me, an utter failure of government.
Yeah.
Because they are essentially wards of the state at that time. We have the responsibility for their security. We can't provide that.
Is the federal government looking at this? Is the federal government looking at Florida going, hey, you guys need to get this shit figured out?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously we've had federal investigations of our women's facilities. We have varying levels of investigations that go on in Florida at any given time. The challenge is the federal government's facing the same challenges. Their prison system is a hot mess. They've just had to close a women's facility because of all the abuse that was going on there. There's really terrible stories about the transition from that facility where corrections officers took out the anger that they were having to close down that facility on the inmates that were in the buses and transitioning. So they're facing their own challenges. Alabama is under federal essentially supervision. Some states have been under federal supervision for years, where the courts have essentially taken over, and not only do they take over the policy, they take over the checkbook. And that's really what drives states to actually fix this problem.
Wow. Gosh.
Yeah. It's, look, I can talk about prisons all day, but I know we've got other things to cover, but it's.
Well, we could do like a 3-hour podcast on this.
On the prison system. Yeah.
Truthfully, I didn't know the issue was this bad. And it makes me question why. Why don't I know this? Why aren't there more news articles about these facts?
Because, I mean, look, you talk to the folks in the media, the prison discussion doesn't generate attention. People go, well, if you do the crime, you do the time, which is a great slogan. It's a really crap policy, right? Like,
that's a good point. We are talking about criminals, no matter what way you think of it. Truthfully,
they want people to go away,
right?
And they want them fixed, and they want them to come back. If they come back into society, they want them better than they found them. Unfortunately, that's not what happens in Florida prisons. Again, we warehouse. Half your inmates in Florida prisons can't read at the 6th grade level. They will spend 4 or 5 years with us. They will get no education while they're in. And they will leave reading at the 6th grade level.
You're just setting people up for failure with not enabling them to grow skills, at least while they're doing time. It makes complete sense.
Yes. And but it's also really hard to get things through the legislature.
We need to look at it like an investment too. Like releasing all of these people on the street with no education, no opportunity, no money, $50 in a bus pass. Well, doesn't it make a lot more sense to invest in these people, invest in these systems, to where when they get out, they're not going to they're not going to commit crimes again. They're going to contribute to society and our economy, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's a clear and obvious choice to me.
Look, I think when you're looking at priorities and you've got X amount of dollars to spend, and your constituencies care about my property insurance rates and the fact that I can't get from point A to point B quickly, and the fact that my kids can't find housing. What are you going to spend your money on? The things that they're talking about, or the things that, frankly, there's a very small group of people whose loved ones are incarcerated are talking about.
The mother and father care about their children more than some criminal, right?
Exactly
that's their
right.
mindset.
That's exactly right. And so the legislature reflects the public, and they will, they'll continue to punt on this issue until things get so bad. I mean, look at property insurance as a prime example. We knew we were way off track in 2017, 2018 on property insurance. The assignment of benefit crisis had started coming up. We started seeing more and more litigation growing, to the point in 2022 when they finally did something on property insurance. Florida was 8% of total U.S. property claims. Like all of the property claims filed in the country, we were 8% of those. We were 80% of the litigation in the country.
Oh my God.
Right? You can't be the most hurricane-prone state and the most litigious state by orders of magnitude and expect low property insurance rates.
Right.
And so that's where the Florida got to a place where it was so bad. We had lost 12 companies, shareholders lost everything. Homeowners were left without property insurance. They were scrambling to find it. Like we were facing the precipice of our Florida property insurance market and therefore our real estate market before the legislature finally in December of 22 in a special session did the things that they knew they had to do 4 or 5 years ago. Why? Because the trial attorneys would back up the Brinks truck to the legislature and say, listen, we have one ask of you. Do nothing. Let this thing play out. And the legislature, for years, did nothing. Like the trial bar figured out long ago, like, why should we support members when we can become them? And so they filled the ranks with trial attorneys, and their goal and purpose was to kind of keep things from, like, keep the goose laying that golden egg. And they were making billions of dollars in Florida off of this scheme of insurance and assignment of benefits, of contractors, of fraud, and that it was they'd go into subdivisions, they would offer somebody a $300 Amazon gift card to get up on their roof. They'd say, well, a hailstorm came through here 3 years ago, and we think we can probably say there's damage in your roof, knowing that this was a subdivision that was developed 20 years ago, and all the roofs in that subdivision were all 20 years old. And they would go up, and then they would go, they would say, oh, we found some damage. And then they would immediately file a lawsuit, because the homeowner, the insurance company would say that's damage because your roof is 20 years old and needs to be replaced. And then they would go to the next house and they'd say, we got your neighbor a brand new roof. Right. And then they go to the next house in the subdivision, the next house. All these houses had different insurers because insurers don't insure street after street after street. They want one house in the neighborhood, and then they want another house in another neighborhood. So you would have hundreds of, you would have home after home in that community where you and I were buying our neighbors' brand new roofs, and we're paying for it in higher insurance premiums. It got to be so, it was so bad that, the Orange County or Orlando area, there was an acronym that was developed, and insurance companies wanted to be out of Orange County, Seminole, Lake, and Osceola. They didn't want anything to do with those counties because of the amount of subdivisions, the amount of litigation going on. Where oftentimes the homeowner would get $20,000 or $30,000 for the roof, but the attorney was making $70,000 or $80,000 on that claim. And that was happening case after case, time after time, and bankrupted the insurance industry, and caused rates to skyrocket to where they are today.
So what changed in 2022? This new law. I've heard about it, but what are the details?
So the major three things that happened were this: Florida had what they called the one-way attorney fee statute, which said if you went to court, you sued your property insurance company, and you got $1 more than what the insurance company offered you, the insurance company had to pay all your legal fees.
Whoa.
Right? So what's the incentive? Sign people up and sue. Because, they're going to settle on most of them, and we're going to settle for more than what we want, and we can include our attorney's fees in the settlement. Or take them to court and get fees. And in Florida, we had a fee multiplier too. So there was cases where the court could award 2 times attorney's fees, 1.7 times attorney's fees. So that attorney that was making $500 an hour on that case, now they just made $1,000 an hour on that case. And so the threat of the one-way attorney fee statute plus the multiplier was enough to make companies settle claims that they otherwise would not have settled. Because the litigation they were facing and the attorney's fees was so much more than settling the claim. And that's fine.
That's
if
kind
it
of how
happens.
that house of cards fell, is they just started settling, and then
Right. And then when you have assignment of benefits as well, where you as a homeowner can assign your benefits to a third party, right? This combination of one-way attorney's fees and assignment of benefits is the perfect storm for destroying an insurance account, the insurance market.
Right.
Because you could have roofers come knock on somebody's door, say, listen, we got your neighbor a brand new roof. We'd like to get up here and take a look. Oh, you've got damage. Don't worry. Just sign this form and we'll take care of it for you. There was hundreds, thousands of examples where homeowners didn't even know that they were suing their insurance company because they had assigned their insurance policy claim to that roofer in an assignment of benefits. You've dealt with this before. I guarantee you have. You've had somebody come up to you and say, listen, you've been in a Walmart parking lot or something like that, and somebody says, you've got a crack on your windshield. We can replace that windshield. Just sign this piece of paper. Well, that's an assignment of benefits to the auto glass, that auto glass company, and they're going to go after your insurer to replace your auto glass.
Whoa.
And you don't even know it, but that's what you would effectively be doing. But when it happens at roofs at scale, that's when we run into this problem where you're overwhelming these companies with claims that they have not actuarially prepared for, and they could never catch up, right? That's why you saw rates going up 30, 40, 50% a year, right? Because they're just trying to catch up. They've got to take those actuarially sound models to the Office of Insurance Regulation, and they've got to get them approved. And they were approving them because they were seeing bankruptcies for the companies that weren't asking for enough, right? And so this is what drove us to the brink.
Now, what state could you even look to compare Florida to? We're in a tropical environment. We're so unique. We have a massive hurricane season every year. It's like clockwork.
And the other thing is we don't have the large national carriers in Florida operating at the scale that they do in other states. Like if you go to Tennessee, you're going to have Allstate, State Farm, the farmers
Right.
insurance, like the big national players are there. Florida is not that state. Like Florida has, 15,
because we're risky with hurricanes, et cetera, flooding.
Because after Hurricane Andrew, the major players in the property insurance market firewalled off the state. So they have small companies that are, if you're dealing with State Farm in Florida, you are not dealing with nationwide mothership State Farm. You're dealing with State Farm of Florida, a separate company that
can go bankrupt, and then Big State Farm is protected.
They firewalled off the state of Florida. And so most of the, a lot of the companies that were formed are smaller Florida-based or Florida specialty companies that operate here. Some of them now have expanded outside the state of Florida, and some other companies have grown into the state of Florida. But they generally are, 50, 75, 100,000 policies. They're not a million policies like State Farm or, whatever their number is, right? They're smaller companies, and they're heavily dependent on reinsurance. And reinsurance, for your listeners, is insurance for insurance companies. And they're based out of Bermuda. They're based out of London. That's where a bulk of them that are based out of. But they're what really drives the insurance market in the state of Florida, because they're placing, Florida insurance companies are basing their risk on Florida. Reinsurers base their risk worldwide, right? They're concerned about typhoons in Japan and earthquakes in California, because they're the ones who are ultimately backing with their money the insurance companies in the state.
Yeah, I would imagine you could look to California. They have that seismic issue, earthquakes over there. But then again, it's so sporadic.
Well, nobody buys an earthquake insurance in California.
Nobody buys it.
Right. It's super expensive. It's priced people out.
It's not required for mortgages like it is for flood here.
No.
See, Florida is such a unique state in that way. And then also, too, how does the government tell a company that's job is to assess risk where you can and can't place policies? Because it would kind of make sense, I think, to alleviate the issue to say an insurance company cannot discriminate on where someone lives, right? That would seem to bring carriers back here. But the problem is, how could you tell an insurance company to do that? Because their job is to assess risk, and risk has a lot to do with where you live.
Well, that's called redlining. And you can't redline communities. So you can't say, well, this is a predominant African American community. I'm not going to write in that community. But you can make sure you don't have concentration risk, right? You don't want all of your policies as a company in Miami-Dade and Tampa Bay.
Right.
Unfortunately, Citizens Property Insurance is predominantly concentrated in Miami-Dade and Tampa Bay, right? And it creates real challenges. So we've talked about how challenging the prison system is in Florida. Think about this. Citizens Property Insurance, the insurer of last resort, in some cases only resort for individuals, has about $10 to $11 billion in cash. It currently insures $560 billion worth of risk. Like, we would never let Citizens Property Insurance be an insurance company if it was private with those kind of numbers.
And we've had storms hit Miami and travel across to Tampa.
Yeah, right.
So imagine the risk that's out there. So explain Citizens real quick. So is it a state-run insurance company, or how exactly does it work?
Yeah, it's a quasi-state-run insurance company. It is backed by the taxpayers of the state of Florida. If Citizens runs out of money, it will then turn to you and me with our private policies and both assess our home and our auto policies. Everybody, if you go out, pull out your bill right now, we have a thing called FIGA, the Florida Insurance Guarantee Association. It's essentially the FDIC for banks that insures your bank deposits. We have FIGA, which insures the insurance companies and ensures that admitted carriers, at least, those are carriers that are approved to operate in Florida on an admitted basis, where the state is the regulator for those companies and regulates their rates and their forms. If those companies go under, which the 12 companies that we've talked about that went under, those were admitted companies, we actually guarantee those policies, and you and I end up paying an assessment to cover that guarantee.
So how would it work? I mean, aren't we setting ourselves up for failure by having a policy related to taxpayers? What if a storm comes through, 10 billion, 15 billion? That's not nearly enough to cover damages.
So, exactly right. So you've just kind of distilled down what breaks the house of cards of Florida. So Florida has three major programs. It has Citizens, which people are familiar with. It has the CAT Fund, which operates as a state-owned reinsurer, right? It's a state-run, nonprofit reinsurer that admitted companies are essentially forced to pay into, but it does cover kind of the donut hole of reinsurance. And then finally, you have the Florida Insurance Guarantee Association. And so the disaster scenario of Florida is 2 major storms in a year that hit Tampa Bay or Miami, that cause multiple billions of dollars of damage, and that take down 2 or 3 companies with them. So here's what would happen. Citizens would run out of money and have to do emergency assessments. So the way that they do that is they go out to the bond market and they borrow $5 billion. Now, you don't have to pay that $5 billion all back at once. So they go to your bill and my bill and they assess it. The CAT Fund runs out of money. This has never happened before, but this is the disaster scenario. The CAT Fund runs out of money. What does it do? It goes to the bond market, and then it can turn around and assess you and me on our policies. And FIGA runs out of money and turns around and can assess you and me on our policies. So there is a potential for us to pay 10, 12, 14% more every year if we have a disaster scenario on our home policies and our auto policies for years to come. Like it could be, a 10-year period if we have this kind of disaster scenario play
And if
out.
the storm is bad enough, maybe never catch up.
Yeah, right. Because you don't know what's going to happen next year, right? You could have a 1 in 50-year event followed by a 1 in 60-year event, followed by a wave after wave.
Well, it's also like we're not even talking about something like a what if. No, it's happened before.
Right. Well, we model for this.
We
right?
know that there's massive hurricanes on our radar that are going to be hitting in the next, maybe it's this season, maybe it's in 20 years. We have no idea, but it will happen.
Right.
I think it was when was the last storm, the bad one in Tampa? It was like 1921 or 1929. My grandfather told me there was water up to the Columbia restaurant store. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine if that hit today?
Yeah.
And we've been lucky over the last few years. We were projected to have major storms hit here and just got lucky at the last second.
Look at Hurricane Ian, right? The one
it's
that
a
went
roll
through
of the dice.
The one that went through Fort Myers, had that hit Tampa Bay and pushed the water into Tampa Bay. I mean, who knows how it would play it? Game over, right? Citizens would have had billions and billions of dollars of damage. The private insurance agency industry would have had billions of dollars of damage.
So why is it set up like a crapshoot? I mean, What's the origin of
part of it is this has been necessary, right? When the major companies pulled out, you had to the state had to rely on the people that were willing to deploy capital into the state, and that was what made it so bad. Was for the last 5 years, the insurance industry in Florida has lost $1 billion every single year. Last year was the first year a lot of the companies made money. Not all of them made money, but some of them really made money. That was why the one-way attorney's fees, the assignment of benefits, and frankly, we haven't talked about this, but citizens' rates became a real problem. Under Charlie Crist, they capped the amount of money that citizens could raise they could raise their rates every year. And so when companies were raising their rates 20, 30, 40% a year, Citizens was raising its rates 7% a year, 8% a year. Well, over years, what ended up happening is Citizens is now 50% cheaper in Tampa Bay and in Miami-Dade than your marketplace, your other insurers in the marketplace. So politically, what would you have to do? You would have to raise rates 100%, which is not going to happen politically to catch up, right? If you're 50% below, you've got to raise rates 100% to get back to par, kind of back to.
And you're also going to write so many policies because it's the cheapest insurance.
Well, right. And agents are going to find ways to get their clients into Citizens if they can. Mm-hmm. And we know this happens. So despite the fact that, you're supposed to get 3 declination letters in order to get this, agents will find a way for some clients to get them into Citizens. And that creates its own set of challenges. And this is why Citizens has grown from 500,000 policies, a decade ago to 1.4 million policies today, or 1.3 million policies today.
What does it represent in terms of the total share of the insurance market?
Oh, about 15%, 16%.
Wow.
Of the total insured value. And, condo insurance, they're huge issue right now in Florida with this condo insurance after Surfside and everything else. Citizens is growing in that space. They don't want to grow in that, but they are. The one-way attorney fee statute, the Citizens is still, up until a couple of years ago, like 40% of all the claims that came into Citizens were litigated. Right? That was that much litigation going on. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been sued in your life or been a part of an organization that was sued one time. Imagine getting sued 900 times a month. That's what Citizens was getting. That's the kind of level of litigation that was going on in Florida.
Right. Well, it's completely out of control, and I don't like to hear that connection between the attorneys and the insurance companies, and then it almost sounds like it's in a weird way like this whole conspiracy for these attorneys to make money, just because it's.
It doesn't sound like it. It's exactly what it was.
Now in 2022, was that solved for, or you're saying?
Yeah. So think about this: 49 other states don't have a one-way attorney fee. What happens? You pay your own attorney's fees. What does that do? Well, you go, listen, I can pay the attorney. We can go to court, but there are other legal. There are legal mechanisms. I can go to what they call appraisal, where we hire a neutral umpire and they look at the case. We can go to mediation, where you have an attorney, I have an attorney. We don't go to court, but we work it out, right? Mm-hmm. There are there's kind of non-judicial diversion kind of mechanisms that Florida's had for years in place, but the incentive was to rack up those attorney's fees, right? Many of these cases took 3 years, 4 years to settle, to get it fully adjudicated, and through the appellate process, sometimes even longer. And so these attorneys were racking up those fees the entire time and cashing in,
brother.
So
wow.
Love for you to have an insurance executive in here sometime to kind of tell you, it's the faces of death talk of how this industry played out and why Florida was so close to losing its entire real estate industry. And still in many ways, I mean, the condo industry is devastated right now because of Surfside, the legislation that the legislature put out that forced everybody to come up to current standards with reserves. Mm-hmm. I mean, many of these condos had not properly reserved for years. But, you bought a condo 2 years ago under the old law, and now all of a sudden the law changes and you're facing, a $60,000 assessment on your $300,000 condo unit.
Well, the problem too is we had a condo boom in the 1970s, and buildings that were 10, 15, 20 years old. Well, now guess what? Those are going to be 50 years old. Mm-hmm. And there's so many mitigations that need to be had for a 50-year-old building rather than a newer one.
And if you haven't kept up with your reserves,
which many haven't.
And this is why, there is a real challenge in a fire sale in many of these condominiums buildings around the country.
And of course, the HOAs are going up, the insurance premiums are going up.
Correct, right? I mean, while we were hearing about 30 or 40% increases in the homeowners insurance market, it would not be uncommon to hear about a 70 or 80% increase in the condo market.
Yeah.
And these are people on fixed incomes; they can't afford it.
That's the other big issue too. Is that we have a huge elderly population in these condominiums. Where the hell are they going to go?
This is it, right? So we said, well, you have to have it fixed in 2 years. Well, that requires a 60. You either have to borrow the money and pay it out over multiple years, or you have to assess $60,000 to your residents, or in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars to your residents, to deal with this issue. It's a mess.
I was talking to someone who is a lender, and he was talking about some new way HOAs and condo associations could actually borrow money for this specific reason, and how maybe the government could set up some sort of a loan program.
Yeah,
where
I think that's I think there's
that
opportunities
could be
to
a way
do
out.
that. Yeah, there is opportunities to do that, right? So,
What is the Florida Policy Project specifically looking at? I mean, short answer, we could probably go all day on this, but what are some goals and policies we could put in place to alleviate these issues?
So we're working on a condo best practices study right now, but the simple truth is you need more competition in the state. You need to attract private capital, and in order to attract private capital, it's got to be profitable, right? You can't. Nobody's going to tell you if I started with we've lost $1 billion every year for the last 5 years. You want to give me $100 to put into a property, or you want to give me $10 million to put into a property insurance company that we can then lose it within 2 years? No. There has to be some certainty that we can write profitable business. And this was what kept Florida, on its back foot when we had this one-way attorney fees, assignment of benefits, and citizens rate caps, because you were able to push policies into citizens for half price. And you were facing this litigation wave if you got into the insurance business. And people were like, well, I'll just invest in, I'll go invest in NVIDIA or Microsoft. I don't need to do this.
Right.
So that's what has happened in Florida. We have to attract private capital. The state can't do it all, right? There are some legislators who are like, let the state take all the wind, right? Well, that's like taking the Titanic and just aiming it straight for the iceberg, because the liability there is like trillions of dollars, not billions.
You're making a very dangerous bet, like we talked about earlier with hurricanes. Is storm activity something they look at heavily? Like, let's just say for the next close to a decade, we had no real major storms.
Right.
Things were easy. I'm sure carriers would come back. And
well, that's what happened. When we had 4 or 5 years without storms.
Right.
And that's where you saw a proliferation of Florida property insurance companies. But they weren't prepared for the assignment of benefits and one-way attorney fees kind of cabal that happened, where technology allowed people to go back. I'm sure you don't know this, but it used to be in Florida homeowners policies that for a catastrophic claim, if it was a hurricane, you had 3 years to file that claim. But if it was a non-catastrophic event, you had 5 years to file that claim. So a hailstorm comes through when your kid's in 9th grade. You don't have to file that claim till you're a freshman in college. Like, how does an insurance company even adjust that? Like, we have to go back 5 years in time to figure out what actually happened here.
Yeah.
So Florida shrunk those timeframes, but there were years where the attorneys figured out, oh my gosh, we can go back, we can look for hailstorms that were 5 years ago, and we have the technology at scale to do this now. Jesus Christ. And this is the stories I could tell you about how this thing played out and where the crazy things that have kind of gone in the litigation world. It's pretty amazing.
And really, we're kind of only talking about homeowners insurance and hurricanes, but then, bring up car insurance. It's another massive issue here in Florida. Super, super expensive.
Well, yeah. And think about this. You have a 1 in 5 chance driving around Florida that if somebody hits you, they're not going to have insurance. In Miami-Dade, it's probably 1 in 3. And as car insurance gets more expensive, more and more people drive without it.
Right.
So you get into this negative feedback loop. One of the studies we're working on right now is kind of best practices in auto insurance.
Are you not required to have insurance in Florida?
Oh, you are, but you can get your car registered, and then cancel it, and then drive around, and that's what people do. They, or they drive their neighbor's car or somebody else's car, there is just a whole ton of people who go out and get insurance and then drop it and then drive without it.
Sounds like law enforcement could play a big role there, but then how do you check up on that? Like logistically, how do you get to those people and find those people? Who are they? Oh my Lord, what a mess.
You know what?
But that's your job, right?
But what it sounds like is we need a strategy.
Right.
And we don't have one.
Right.
And this is the problem, right? I mean, well, let's shift and talk about housing for a minute.
Yeah.
Right. Because, mostly a real estate podcast.
This is interesting stuff.
Although we've covered lots of topics today.
This is deep stuff that is scary, truthfully.
Yeah.
It's scary being young and, building a business here and a family. And you look at all this and go, we got to figure this shit out. Like the idea that we're in some static environment here in Florida, like a lot of people say, stop moving here, keep the New Yorkers out, blah, 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 blah. All this stuff about growth. It's coming.
They're coming.
We can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And how do you blame them? Like you said, no income tax, beautiful state, sunshine, great
quality
airport,
of life. Yeah.
The list goes on.
And the housing challenge is profound. Right?
Yeah.
You want to build a housing unit anywhere in Tampa Bay right now. It's going to cost you an apartment. It's going to cost you $300,000 a door. A lot anywhere pretty much in St. Petersburg or Tampa is going to be $120 to $100 plus $150,000 just for the lot.
An investor paid over $600,000 a door for Novel Midtown.
Yeah, right. And
out of state.
Right. And what would it cost to build that new today? It would cost $400,000 a door to build that new, or maybe more, maybe $500,000 a door to build that new. That's the challenge we're running into is like we can't replace the existing stock for anywhere near what we paid when we originally started with this thing, or even adjusted for inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're facing real challenges in the affordable housing space. And you kind of summarized it. Like we have 1,000 people moving to Florida every single day, 800 to 1,000 people moving to Florida every single day. And we have got to figure out how we're going to build more units, like radically more units. And people want to live close to downtown. They want to live close to services. So how do we allow for more, how do we build more housing units on the existing land that we have today? We've seen out of Tallahassee, Live Local, right? Which really should be entitled Live in Apartments, because Live Local bill essentially only deals with apartment complexes. But most people don't live in apartments. Most people live in other units. So we have to think about what are we going to do with the rest of these units? And so Florida Policy Project has looked at across the country, and we've said that, look, there's real strategies out there for dealing with this. There are other states, California, there are lots of states that have dealt with this issue. And you need kind of an all hands on deck approach. You can't just focus on apartments and think that they're going to deal with housing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's everybody's going to live in those apartments. I like to think of housing as a pyramid. You actually need housing at the top. Like you need you need that high end luxury stop product, because if you don't have that, what happens? Well, they push down into the middle, and if you don't have enough in the middle, they push into the bottom, and then they push the people at the bottom into your motels because they don't have to come up with the first and last month's rent.
That's the story of the last few years.
Right. This is what happens.
Yep.
You need housing at all levels. So when people say, "Oh, there's another $100 million condo going up," I'm like, "Great, we need that." But we also need the next duplex to be built, right?
And everything in between.
So, what happens if we got radical about this? Like, why can't you build an accessory dwelling unit in Tampa? Like, why do we keep them? Why hasn't the city council developed a philosophy of allowing people to build accessory garage apartments, granny flats, whatever you want to call them, on people's homes? It's a housing unit, right? And they'll say, "Oh, Airbnb, people will just use them all for Airbnbs." Well, that's not what the data shows, right? Just as many people are going to use them for like garage bands.
It used to be called a mother-in-law suite.
Right, mother-in-law
I don't know
suites,
where
right?
ADU even came from.
Yeah, that's kind of like the technical term, but accessory dwelling unit, right? But if we allowed them, you would see hundreds of people in Tampa building accessory dwelling units. If we allow people to split lots by right, instead of having that, single family home on the quarter-acre lot, which is kind of traditional. What if we allow people to split those lots? Well, now I can put 2 units in that same spot. Now they're going to be narrower and thinner, and they're going to cost less. They're going to cost half maybe not half, but they're going to cost less because the land cost has been cut in half. If I allowed you to build on that same quarter-acre lot a duplex or a triplex, right? I mean, if you drive around Old Northeast, or you drive around, downtown Tampa, South Tampa specifically, what do you see? You see a single family home next to a duplex, next to a garden style apartment. Why? Because all those homes and all that zoning took place prior to 1930, right? Because that's what the market demanded then. But it's what's the market's demanding now. But you have the people who are the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard, that come into the state and they say, look, I'm going to only have single family homes on this quarter acre lot. That's the only thing you can build on that facility, on that zoning. Developers, they would love to develop different product mixes, but no, the county wants, or the community wants, single family homes, because that's the American dream. No, the American dream is I want a place that I can afford to live. I mean, think about how far you would have to drive to qualify for a starter home today. Like, you'd be in Plant City, or you'd be in Lakeland, you'd be, Orlampa.
Well, the pyramid description was perfect, because that's what happened with first-time home buyers. Typically in Tampa, a first-time home buyer could go buy a home for $300, $350, $450 would get you a great place. Well, all the people that moved out of state that had cash, that was a steal for them. So they bought it instead of a native Floridian that's been here, instead of a young couple trying to find a home. So like you said, if you don't have that top of the pyramid, it pushes down to the middle. And then the middle has no place to go. That's a problem. And when there's no place to go, when there's no supply level, and you have a high level of demand, you have an increased price level. Right. Everyone knows that. It's basic economics, right? So it's to me, oddly, it's obvious what's happening here. You have this need. You have a need on paper. You have a need in the numbers. You can look at the people moving here. You can look at the number of units we have and go, okay, we need to build more, right? You have that. But what you also have is a shift in lifestyle. My generation, generations older than me, and Tyler's generation, we want walkable. We want to live in an urban.
You want to live on campus
in general, right? Of course, you want to be on campus, right? You want to be in the mix. You want to be where the attention is and where all the exciting things are. And in order to do that, you have to have density. And if you don't have that, where are we going to go? I've worked with people that were looking for homes here that are graduates of UT, college educated kids. They have great jobs, 60, 70 grand a year, which used to be really good. You should have been able to at least buy a small $200,000 condo, whatever. They can't do it now. No. So what are they doing? Well, they're going to Charleston. They're going to Savannah, Georgia. So we're losing talent. We're losing highly educated, young, ambitious talent for other states and other cities because we don't have housing supply for them. What a shame. And what a short-sighted way to position ourselves as a city. I think this is the most pressing matter, and I think the city needs to immediately increase density, at least in the urban core. Save South Tampa, the suburbs. We can talk about that. That's a fight to have for sure. You're going to have neighbors upset. There's a fourplex next to my house. That's definitely a fight. But in the urban core downtown, let a city grow into a city. There's also another fight too environmentally. I don't like seeing driving from Tampa to Sarasota and every freaking tree and pasture is ripped up for single family home development. I mean, it's a terrible thing in my eyes to see all that.
But that's what happens if you don't have density where people want to live.
That's the city's fault.
Well, and but the challenge is, they're not incentivized to change policy, right? There's going to be this vocal group of people who say, no, listen, this will change the nature and character of my community, and I don't want that. And so what do politicians do? They do nothing, right? I'm going to get through the next election before I do anything, right? It's 2 years away.
Well, it's probably a powerful fact if you have 10 people in front of you at a meeting screaming and advocating for one cause, and the other side is silent. And I think that's kind of what's happening is you have this vocal minority who's saying, not in my backyard.
Right.
When every statistic, even the ambitions of everyone, maybe would vote the other way. They're just not showing up. So I think a lot of it has to do with education and information.
A lot of it has to do with incentives, right? So if Tallahassee, for example, gave you a menu of options as our city or county and said, listen, you have to choose from this menu of options. And if you choose not to choose from this menu of options and change some of the zoning or allow for lot splits or allow for accessory dwelling units or have a strong voucher program in your community, then you get $0 of affordable housing dollars from Tallahassee. That's the incentive people need to get over the NIMBYism. But today, Florida doles out $700 million to 67 counties, and it treats Miami-Dade the same as it does Liberty County in many ways. But they're radically different communities and
yeah.
counties
Yeah.
as it relates to the population, and the
Everything,
types
culture.
of problems, right? You know, and you go, oh well, the state spent $700 million on affordable housing last year. It sounds like so much money until you go, all right, divide it by 67, and you realize, like, what am I going to build for $12 million in Miami-Dade?
Especially when you consider the migration and the demographics
Right.
and the people moving here.
Right.
Like, this is the biggest issue we have. It truly
Right.
is.
You're going to spend $10 million, $12 million in Pinellas. Good luck.
Here's the thing. If we can at least get housing to an affordable level, okay, well, then the insurance is a little bit less of an issue. The interest rates are a little bit less of an issue in terms of total cost for homeowners.
Yeah.
And
So
and renters too.
So ultimately, you need to let the market play itself out, and you need to get government out of the way. You need to let developers develop what communities need and want as far as products, and that is a radical shift.
Yeah.
Allowing duplexes to come into communities that were traditionally single-family homes or triplexes, allowing for accessory dwelling units. We can't even get the simple things. Accessory dwelling units are like the simplest thing.
Right.
But we've had battles in Tampa and St. Pete and other places where they just don't want to allow. They won't allow accessory dwelling units.
It could also be neighborhood specific, and I know in Tampa they've kind of spoke about Tampa Heights and Seminole Heights specifically having ADUs, which it makes sense to go neighborhood by neighborhood. I guess, but
the challenge is then, what happens if you live in South Tampa?
Yeah.
And you can't. It's illegal to put them in.
I just know that there's a fight, and I think
Right, but you've got to have the incentive to get over that fight.
yeah,
You need housing everywhere. You need units everywhere. You're not going to get there building just apartments. You're not going to get there limiting your accessory dwelling units to Seminole Heights. The math doesn't work.
a buddy of mine, James Lascara, he was on the podcast before. He's a real estate investor, and he bought a lot in the North Hyde Park area. I think that's future land use is, whatever lot he bought, future land use, you could have 2 lots there, right? Instead of some simple process where he could clearly demonstrate, like, hey, the neighbor's house across the street was split, the house over here was split, and the future land use here supports the split. He still had to go before council. I watched the meeting. I sent in an email to council. He asked me to show my support, which was fine. But the whole time I'm kind of advocating for this, and I'm watching him on the video speak at council. I'm thinking, what are we doing? Like, why are we wasting time? What are we doing sitting here for 45 minutes talking about one lot, one parcel of land that's 50 freaking feet wide, that already has a precedent with the future land use, that already has precedent with other parcels in the neighborhood?
Yeah.
What are we doing?
The lesson there is we're doomed.
Yeah.
Like, we're doomed.
If we continue down this path, things will get so much worse. And I think that's the education piece that I'm kind of like alluding to, this like ignorance of the NIMBYism. And I totally understand the grievances. But man, if we do nothing, it'll get worse. And that's what they don't understand.
We're doomed, right? Like,
their kids are doomed.
Yeah, their kids are doomed. Your nurses are doomed. Your police officers.
Our economy's doomed.
Where are they going to live?
The college-educated kid is doomed.
Look at these hospitals and look at where their $25 an hour employees are. Like, how far away do they have to live? It's a major issue across the healthcare system, across the education system, across the law enforcement system. They can't live in their communities.
Talking with the leasing executives at a lot of these large companies and that work at the large developments, they are ashamed is the wrong word, but they're saddened to talk to these national companies coming here to Tampa, because the companies go, yeah, cool, great, cute new development. Where are my people going to live?
Right.
Where are their kids going to go to school? These big businesses need those numbers, those demographics to support moving here. It's no question why some of these big businesses haven't moved here. And the only thing you're seeing is luxury condos. Well, there's no incentive for a big business to move here because of those issues.
Well, we're missing the middle, and we need the right incentives, and we need leadership in order to do it. And it can't just be one city. It's got to be done at a statewide level.
Yeah. And
you need a strategy, and you need to base that strategy on best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to look around the country and figure what those are. And this is where our organization has been working, and why I think our strategy is the right one. We have to move away from this tactical way of thinking about things. We have to think about statewide solutions that scale. And there are only a handful of ways to radically increase the amount of housing supply. They are smaller lot sizes, getting rid of parking minimums, allowing for accessory dwelling units, focusing on upzoning, and looking at, when you're building apartment developments, allowing for density bonuses for lower income housing units to be part of those. We don't want aggregated poverty. We don't want Caprini Green. We don't want, the housing projects.
Mm-hmm.
No, we want individual apartment complexes that are traditionally housing the middle class to add additional units that may be for people that are 50% of adjusted median income or median income or 80% of adjusted median income. But what are the incentives in place and necessary for that deal to still pencil out, that are simple and straightforward, that incentivizes the developers to add that to every project that they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
That's the conversation that we should be having, but we're not. And until we have the courage to have that conversation at a statewide level, then, again, if we just use the insurance example, things are going to have to get a lot worse before the legislature gets their back to a wall and has no other choice but to do the right thing. Like Churchill said about Americans, he said, Americans tend to do the right thing after we've exhausted all other options, right? Historically, this is where we've seen ourselves go again and again. And this is where I feel like Florida is ultimately going to be, because that's where California is, right? That what finally forced people to change their opinion on some of these things was things got too bad.
Mm-hmm.
And they finally changed it. You don't have to be at the edge of the cliff before you make these decisions. Unfortunately, my experience is that that's typically where Florida goes, right? The thing that keeps us, the threat that keeps Florida's prison system from going off the edge and us spending more money there is that the federal government will take over, and they'll take over our checkbook too. Mm-hmm. The thing that ultimately got the Department of, got the insurance issue getting moved in the right direction was 12 company failures and the entire insurance industry looking like it was going to go off the cliff. That's what's going to have to take in housing. Mm-hmm. Things may have to get a lot worse before cities, counties, but frankly, the state changes the incentives to redevelop at scale and add density at scale.
Is there a state or city you've found that in some ways has it right, or at least is further along than we are?
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of states are dealing with these problems.
Yeah.
Lots of states have better practices. And lots of states, and the defined list of things that I talked about are all from other states that are doing it better than what Florida's doing.
You mentioned parking minimums. I think Minneapolis got rid of their parking minimums.
Right.
And, I think maybe it's an old school way of thinking, and maybe it's because of the age of politicians in this country. But, for a long time, it made sense to have parking minimums, right? In the 1970s and 80s, when everyone lived in the suburbs and downtowns were blighted and emptied out, well, yeah, you need to have a parking minimum, or else where the hell are people going to park? But today, Tampa has an overabundance of parking in its downtown.
Look, we park for the day after Thanksgiving, right? Like we park these places, and developers are limited to what they can build. You want to build structured parking, it's going to be $25,000, $35,000, $45,000 a space.
Per space. Yeah.
Which adds to the cost. And, that ultimately gets passed along to the residents. And this is why things cost so much, right? Like, because we're not just building the unit, we're building a $40,000 parking space for your car.
I've always thought, let the developer make that risk assessment for his own project, right?
Sure.
If I want to build a building and put no parking lot, and I'm betting that people will bike, Uber, scooter, whatever, in a particular location, as long as it's in a downtown core and somewhere that makes sense, why not let the developer make that risk?
That seems rational. But when we would tell them they have to have 2.2 spaces, or you have to have one space per bedroom,
it screws up their deal.
Yeah, the deal doesn't pencil, or they just have to raise the prices.
We're holding ourselves back. It's so clear. Do you believe it'll change quickly? I mean, do
no, I don't. No. Listen,
you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
No, as I explained, listen, things are going to have to get a lot worse before the legislature is going to find the courage and to do the right thing. Milton Friedman, one of my favorite economists, says you'll never get the right people in public office. He says the best you can hope for is to make it politically popular for the wrong people to do the right thing. Right? When is that political tipping point going to happen where the wrong people are willing to do the right thing because that's the political popular thing to do? When your kids now need to go out and look for a house and it's, the minimum starter home is $700,000 and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to put $300,000 out of my pocket, but nobody else can afford to do that in order to house my kid in someplace. I mean, this is where we're headed if we don't change direction now. Is, back to the Churchill quote, we'll end up doing the right thing after every other option's been exhausted.
Jeez.
This has been a really uplifting conversation. I'm glad that we've
doom and gloom
talked. Well, I mean,
you know what?
But
Though,
it's truth.
Let's tie in that fourth pillar because transportation relates so much to affordable housing. I think if we had a more adequate transportation network, it would actually alleviate a lot of these issues we're talking about, and maybe even better and easier to convince a local government, hey, release the parking minimum. We've got a trolley stop or light rail or a bus network or something that can provide transportation that you're so worried about.
Yeah, the world of transportation is shifting, right? So I like to think about 2010 to 2020 was the decade of the shared economy. We got Uber and Lyft and DoorDash and, Grubhub. All of those things came available to us in 2010 to 2020. 2020 to 2030 will be the decade of electrification, as we're seeing, Florida's the number 2 state in the country for electric vehicles. People recognize that, but it is. And we have more electric vehicles than virtually other state than California. And 2030 and beyond will be the decade of automation, right? We talk about self-driving vehicles, and that's really when it begins to kick off. And robotaxi is probably a 2035 kind of event where at scale we start to see that. Well, that radically changes things. One of the things that holds everything back today is, people are comfortable that last mile of transportation. I don't really want to walk that in the middle of Florida summer heat. We've got to figure that last mile of transportation out. But the technology is shifting on us here. And, one of the things, people go, oh, we need Brightline from Orlando to Tampa. Well, we have Amtrak today. Most people don't know that.
Goes right through Ybor City.
Right. You can take the Amtrak all the way to Orlando today. The problem is, what do you do when you get there? Right. Now I got to rent a car. I got to get an Uber to go to my, you want to go from one point of Orlando to the other. It's 40 minutes, right?
It's a really good point.
In a good time.
Yeah. You can't, if you were to snap your fingers and say, hey, let's say you could snap your fingers and have a high-speed rail network all throughout Florida. Every major city has a stop in its downtown. Great, but exactly, what do you do when you
Well, you're never going to be able to get from Tampa to Orlando without stopping in Lakeland. I mean, Imperial Polk County will stop you all day long.
Of course, but my point is, yes, when you get there, what do you do? This isn't Europe, right? Everywhere isn't this dense little urban pocket.
We're going to drop you off in Disney or Orlando International Airport.
It is a tricky balance because you do have these lifestyle choices younger people are making to live in urban cores. They want that walkability, but then you also, on the other side, you have a necessity of a car. You can't.
Florida is a car state.
It is a car state, and our entire world is set up for vehicles. So the idea that that's going to shift in the next 5-10 years is it's just not going to.
We're not going to go underground here.
So you're advocating for more autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles in Florida.
I'm not advocating for it. I'm saying that's the direction we're headed. Right? That's the trajectory.
The natural progression.
So as cars get more shared, it makes sense for them to get more electric. And if you have shared electric cars that can be used in an automated fashion, your car sits 95% of the time unused. It's your second most valuable asset that you don't use 95% of the day.
Literally.
and by the way, it's depreciating all the time that you have it there, right? If you didn't have to own it and you could get a vehicle that is 2 or 3 times less likely to get into an accident, that you don't have to worry about driving and you could be productive during that time instead of forces, trying not to crash.
Yeah.
It would radically change lives. And that's where this is the direction that we're headed.
Yeah. Almost an electric autonomous Uber is what you're describing.
Yeah,
essentially.
where you can watch your Netflix shows that you were just finished watching and watch it to your way to your destination or do the
business,
work.
call your wife, whatever.
Work out, whatever. This is the direction that we're heading. But that's it's hard to kind of show people the Jetsons world today.
They're always pointing towards the issues though. Like one Tesla hits a pedestrian for whatever reason. Yeah. And it disrupts this entire momentum, I feel, at least temporarily.
The trajectory is what we need to care about, right? The year that it hits doesn't really matter, right? Whether it's 2030, 2035, that's really irrelevant. It's the trajectory of things and how do we build towards that? So if you look at Vinnick's downtown developments, all of his parking there is flat. It's not sloped roofs. Why? Because he wanted his designers design those buildings because they knew they were going to have a 70-year lifespan. So you could build the buildings down over time instead of building them up, because their belief is you're at some juncture, you're going to have more automated vehicles. You're going to have more of a shared economy in transportation. And if we can make the floors flat, although it costs more today, over time, we can transition those floors into useful, productive space. And while I'm building this building in 2020, maybe 2030, 2040, with 50 years still left on this building, I can turn that space from parking to office or housing.
Fantastic. I didn't know that they did
Yeah.
that. What a genius idea.
So
That development is such a good example of what I would hope every other development in Florida looks like, at least in an urban core.
right. So we have to be thinking, if we know that that's the trajectory of things, right? How are we adopting our building today
Mm-hmm.
to project out for tomorrow?
And the Florida Policy Project is specific on providing some sort of public policy that would drive those changes.
We do best practice research. What is the best practice in the country? Like for in transportation right now, we are working on the best ROI, I would argue, in transportation. And I've got a study that's going on right now with Cutter to look at this with the Expressway Authority as partner with us on this, is timing your signals, your street lights the right way.
Oh, I hate that shit. I get so pissed off.
Right? We're in this world of AI. We're in this world of technology, and yet we have probably 70% of the
Sitting at a red light at midnight,
Right,
no traffic around. Yeah.
70% of the lights in Tampa are probably on simple timers, right? Taylor Swift comes in, the Lightning have a game, doesn't matter. Well, they're timed the exact same way, but we have the technology to have them be variable. We have that technology to use cameras as a sensor and see that there's no cars there and no cars coming.
Yeah.
So let's not change the light yet. And we have the technology to gamify essentially the light systems. So we can set it within parameters. We'll be safe. We have minimum standards, but they can be much more organic in how they're operated on a system-wide basis. And it's the cheapest, best return on investment you can spend in all of transportation is my contention. And I'm hoping to come out with a best practice study probably September, October to prove that.
I think it's fantastic, including AI, including a learned computer that would understand, oh, hey, it's 2 a.m. Maybe I don't leave this light red or whatever it would be. Hey, there's a concert coming. It would check the internet, check Amalie Arena's concert schedule to make sure traffic is flowing in an effective manner. I mean, that makes complete sense. You already have the intersections. You don't need to build new roads to do this. It sounds like you would just need to retrofit whatever intersection you need. It seems like a really quick solution to at least alleviating some traffic.
Yes, it is. So those are the kind of ideas that the state should be focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
I think, one of my big learnings from Tallahassee, which I still find fascinating, is, we have all of these tier 1 research institutions in Florida, all of, UF, Florida State, UCF, all these great colleges. Do you know how many times as a legislator, one of those universities, USF, I can't forget USF, let's not do that, or USF St. Pete, politician, I still have to take care of the hometown. These tier 1 research institutions, 0 times as a legislator did they ever come to me with a policy solution, because they're incentivized not to. They're afraid that if they bring a policy solution to Tallahassee, and Tallahassee doesn't like it, they could lose funding. So it's better to be quiet. Like the Australians have a saying that the tall poppy gets cut off, right? So just keep your head down. And so what we've done over the decades, this is not something that's recent, over the decades, is we've incentivized the universities to not, they work on all kinds of research projects, but virtually none of them are public policy focused or they're not translating that public policy solution to Tallahassee to solve that problem.
Yeah, they go to a different state where they're not afraid.
Well, either that or they just publish it into a national journal and it just goes away. We met our standard and we moved on. We have the Schimberg Center for Housing. We have the College of Research at Florida State for insurance. But they don't provide the data or research or anything to the state because the state doesn't ask, and legislators aren't curious, and there's no mechanism for them to be proactive in this space. Once I had that kind of realization that they're not going to help solve these problems, I went to one of the universities the other day and one of their research departments, and they're like, well, we're working on cataracts and crosswalks, and we've got a federal study to work on that. And I was like, that's really good. I'm really glad you're doing it. How about I-4 traffic?
Right.
Like, what are you doing on that problem? And they're like, oh no, we're not working on that.
Well, you've said today that until things get really, really bad, these legislators aren't going to make changes.
Right.
Traffic is freaking horrible.
Yeah.
So is this something would you say the most at least attentive to out of these issues?
Probably. I mean, look, I think housing and insurance are probably the number 1 and 2 issues in the state of Florida right now. The economy obviously is one, and people's ability to pay fees and fines and fees and taxes and things like that is probably kind of the most overriding issue. But that relates to housing and it relates to transportation. I mean, it relates to property insurance for the most part, auto insurance. I think the legislators are trying to figure out what they can do on those issues, but they don't know why the Florida Policy Project is so valuable, because we do know. They just aren't willing to address those situations. Like, they aren't willing to address the solution yet.
Solutions are so information oriented, right? And we don't live in a vacuum, like you've mentioned many times. And that's exactly what you do, right? You're going to other states, you're hiring companies from different regions of the country to solve these problems, or at least find a recommendation to solve the problems. Yeah. So without the Florida Policy Project, or without public policy projects like yours, how are legislators getting information to make the right decisions currently?
Lobbyists.
For real?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the answer?
Well, I'm not saying lobbyists. That's how they're getting their information today. Right?
So disheartening.
Most legislators aren't going to national conferences. Most legislators aren't digging it. Most legislators are an inch deep and a mile wide. Right? Like, we started by saying, you're going to be dealing, it's your first week in the legislature, and you've got 4 committees to go to. You've got education, agriculture, environment, and criminal justice. And you're a real estate broker. You know nothing about any of those topics. Now, people expect you to, and you've learned to fake it, but you know nothing about them, and you won't be anywhere close to knowledgeable about that until, maybe one of those topics you'll really learn within 4 years. So what do? You trust the people that are in leadership. You trust that they know what they're doing, and you're incentivized to vote with them, right? They're your party. They know what's going on. So you're like, okay, sure, I'll go along because I don't know anything about this. And realize by the time you learn one of those topics, you'll be out of the legislature, right? Because we have 8-year term limits and you're gone.
Sounds like a system issue more than a specific public policy issue.
It's a structural problem that we have in Florida, because our term limits are too short. Our leadership is only there for 24 months, and the issues have gotten so big.
Now, you termed out, you mentioned, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, so even everything we've discussed today, all this good work you're putting in, you can't go back.
No, I can go back. I mean, I can go back in the future. You don't have to stay out forever.
You have to stay out for one term? Sit out one election.
You have to sit out one election. That's the way to think about it. I mean, I know people who have sat out and then immediately come back, and their term limits start back over. Right? They sat out, something happened, and they got to start over. So, yeah. But technically, yeah, you should sit out one cycle.
Got it. Wow. So you think that would be a fix that would solve some of this, is both education, but also the ability to sit there and understand your job and then learn these specific issues. 4 years is a short amount of time, but it's also kind of a standard in America, right? This doesn't sound necessarily like a Florida problem. It just sounds like an American, the way our government's set up type. Yeah, problem.
I'm not saying a lot of states are better than Florida. I mean, all these other states have their own set of problems, right? Yeah. You got people who have been the speaker of that house for 40 years, and if he doesn't have the right idea, look, you're stuck with that guy, right? This is why I'm a fan of term limits, because it's a fail-safe on that guy getting stuck there for 40 years and only following his direction. But ultimately, the big challenge in Florida right now is your leadership is only there for 24 months, really 18. I mean, if you think about it, the last 6 months, they're not in session. And then, they're kind of a lame duck. So really they have 18 months to make those leadership changes. And then the next leadership ultimately takes over and they get 18 months. And this is why we have this kind of Dr. Seuss push me, pull me thing going on in Florida right now, and everything. And this is why people think tactically, they aren't thinking strategically, because it takes more than 1 year or 2 years to change housing policy. It may take a decade, but you've only got 4 years left.
When leadership gets in, are they quick to push whatever party they're in's agenda just because, hey, I'm in, we got 24 months, let's get this done, we need this, we need this?
No, so you assume the party has an agenda, right? the party doesn't have an agenda on housing. It doesn't have an agenda on property insurance. It doesn't have an agenda on criminal justice and prison policy. It doesn't have an agenda for most issues, right? I mean, there is no agenda on marijuana of the parties, right? Like they may take that, but half your Republicans are smoking it and half your Democrats are smoking it, right? Like what they say is different than what they do. Like it's a different world. These parties. It isn't that partisan. It's the fact that we don't think strategically. We aren't thinking about these problems strategically. Our public universities aren't helping us think about these projects and bringing ideas where we have PhDs that are supposed to be experts in these things that can help us solve these problems. We aren't addressing them. And then we do not have the right set of incentives, right? The thing that drove us off the cliff on property insurance was we had set the incentives for the attorneys to make money. And we let that go for way too long. The thing that's kept us from having more housing policy is because a better housing policy is because we've set the incentives wrong in Tallahassee, and we don't incentivize counties and cities to do the things that add more density. The reason that the prison system has fallen apart is because there's no incentives for legislators to talk about it. And the challenge for transportation is there isn't enough money to keep up.
It's a lot of money. It's very expensive. But also, too, I feel like we've been given an opportunity many times in the state for transportation dollars. But the governors over the years, Jeb Bush, what's his name?
You can get
Christie.
money for high-speed rail, sure. But again, you want to build high-speed rail between here and Orlando and you don't want to stop in Lakeland?
Then what?
Great. You can't get a train up to high speed.
But it's a federal grant, right? So it's like free, air quote.
Sure. Look at California. Look at how many miles of high-speed rail they've built for the billions of dollars that they've spent, and it's still not operating, and it won't be operating. The high speed's never going to work in Florida. Medium speed, maybe. But look, Brightline.
Trolley's popular. The streetcar here is very popular.
It's free.
Yeah.
Right?
It's
like
free.
It
was also built over 20 years ago, so good luck getting it in today.
Right. Well, look, if you wanted to extend that, what would the right-of-way cost you today?
A lot more than 20 years ago.
This is why,
and a hell of a lot more than the late.
This is why light rail.
1800s.
This is why light rail isn't going to happen before you get automated vehicles in Florida. Because just acquiring the right of way and building that you'll have vehicles that are automated and electric and shared way before that.
So even though it was federal dollars, was there a state match we had to make? Like, I'm trying to figure out why consistently we've denied it. I understand the issue of it's not going to solve the traffic
because
problem.
ultimately we would have ended up subsidizing it.
That was the fear. Hey, we're stuck with this massive system we have to maintain.
Right. You look at Sunrail in Orlando. They 3 years ago they studied this issue. They had installed this ticketing equipment. And it would cost them $1 million to install that ticketing equipment, and yet they only made $900,000 that year, or something like that, in ticket revenue. So it was more expensive to actually install and keep the ticket system going and maintain it than they were actually getting. It was cheaper for people to ride free than to charge people for it and enforce that.
God,
right?
What a mess.
It's a bad, I tell you these stories, you can't make this up. Like, this is absolutely truth and yet, even today, Orlando has Sunrail. It is incredibly subsidized by the state.
Yeah.
And counties and cities where they were supposed to take over responsibilities and they said, oh, we'll take over the responsibilities. When it came to the time period for them to take it over, they're like, we don't want it. And yet now it's operating.
It's so daunting to look at every one of these issues with the facts about our growth. Like, it's one thing to look at these issues and just be a state and say, okay, we have these challenges, but it's another to say, we know we're going to have 5 million people move here this decade on top of everything we've talked about. Like, it seems like there needs to be more of an urgency at the state level. What is the reception to everything we've talked about today with the current people that are elected officials?
Listen, if our legislature was a football team, we would have a football team of punters, right?
So it's the quality of these individuals?
No, it's the incentives of the individuals are not to take on the hard problems. You know how many times political consultants would come to you and say, listen, Jeff, great idea. Let's just wait till you're after you're elected. Don't take this one on. Don't take these issues on. Like, you're totally right on the policy. It's 100% right on the policy. We just don't want you to talk about this before an election year. because it'll make it harder for you to get reelected. Because if you take on prison issues, or if you take on housing issues like this, or if you take on property insurance, right? The trial bar will spend a ton of money against you if you take it on this issue. Like, this is what legislators are disincentivized from taking on the hard issues, and it's easy to punt.
There's also this horrible incentive in American politics with the ladder game, where I have an ambition to become a state senator, and then I want to run for governor, and then I'd like to run for the federal government. I want to be the United States senator for Florida. And so they're making these decisions based on what people will think of them once they're out. So it's it sounds like what you're describing is you just need this martyr guy who goes in there and doesn't give a shit about reelection, and he just goes in and starts calling the shots and doing these policies, and the constituents are pissed, but it is what it is. It's someone with a long-term growth that just doesn't care.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen this time after time when you have a legislator or somebody in public office that is starting to run for their next office and stops doing the job for their current office. I've seen this time after time after time where, they're always hoping to get to the next office, so they fail to do things in their current office. And that's a structural problem that we deal with. I don't know how to solve it, but it's one that I've seen over and over again.
Well, it's like don't hate the player, hate the game type thing, where the game, right? Literally, like the game itself is set up with these negative incentives, and basic economics says people respond to incentives.
Right. Listen, like, I have to win 2 elections. I have to win a primary, and then I have to win the general. If I can't get out of the primary, the general doesn't matter. Yeah. So why?
And you might have the best idea in the world, but what the hell does it matter if you don't get elected?
So, the incentive there is be farther to the right. And the incentive on the left is be farther to the left. So we want to know why we have this polarized system is because everybody has to win 2 elections. And they're terrified of the first election more so than the second election.
Because it's embarrassing to lose a second time.
It's embarrassing if you're not even like in the game if you're not in the general.
Right.
Like, so they're terrified of losing that first election. So how do I guarantee that I'm going to win that election? Be farther to the right, be farther to the left, right?
Be on the team. Say these things.
Be on the team, but be on the extremes of the team, because that's where the bulk of you've got 20% that are locked into the far right and to the far left. And if I don't secure them right away, then I've got to, then I'm playing on I'm hoping to get the rest of the remainder.
Lock in your base.
Lock in your base, right? Yeah. Like, secure the base. And this is where the political system has gone in America.
Makes me want to puke. Someone, I'm sure Tyler too. That's the thing. Are you mic'd up? Yeah. Oh, well, no worries. But Tyler and I have talked before about being young and being in America and kind of watching this play out. At least, like, I was born in 92. I was there for 9/11, right? I've seen this political shift in this country. You've seen more than me, of course, and my mom has seen more than both of us. But there's something happening in it, and it's this incredible negative structure where you're right. It truthfully, in a lot of ways, isn't necessarily the politicians. It's the way the game is set up. They have to play the game this way.
That's right.
They don't have a choice.
They don't have a choice.
This is what they have to do to be in office, to call these shots, to vote on public policy.
What do people say about a republic? It's the U.S. system of government. It's the worst system of government to come up with, except for all the other. It's like a terrible system of government, except for all the others are worse. I know I butchered that quote, but the simple truth is, it functions. It doesn't function perfectly.
Right.
It's just better than everything else. Like, definitely better than communism, fascism, all the other things we're seeing, right? And other forms, right? But it isn't perfect, right? Like, it has absolute structural flaws. And, Florida is a microcosm of that. Like, we have real challenges. We have
in a huge
flaws.
way. Yeah.
And we have, now, we support term limits. Sure, great. But term limits have their challenges. And we have leadership changes every 2 years. Great. But that has its own challenges. And so we have structural problems built into the system that we have to get around in order to solve these deeper, harder problems.
And probably put in for a good reason. We kind of talked about that. Like, in a lot of ways, they are fail safes.
They are.
I mean,
sure.
that's why there are term limits, which is a good thing. But in America, in every industry, if you look deep enough, people find a way to game the system.
It's game the
whether
system.
you're paying your taxes or whether you're running for office.
Sure, you can game the system, but understand there are because of term limits and because of 2-year speakerships and Senate presidencies and in these short time periods, nobody would say, I want a company and I want to turn my CEO over every 2 years or every 18 months. Right? Nobody would do that. No company in America, to my knowledge, has been successful turning over its leadership every 18 months.
No sports team.
No sports team.
Name
No, right. And yet that's how we have set up the state of Florida, the third largest state, one of the largest economies in the world.
It might be number 2.
Right? Like it's wild to think about this, but there are structural challenges with how we have the state set up that now we are really seeing in full color play itself out.
Well, you've completely shifted my mindset. This has been awesome today. I didn't think that we had so many issues within each one of these pillars you discuss: transportation, affordable housing, prison reform. What was the last
Property
one?
insurance.
Property insurance, right? So it's almost it gets me a little nervous to think about it all. But also, what I find really encouraging is stuff like this, like a podcast, or like, I don't know, the way people connect today. There's more information. I think the start of all of this, hopefully good change that can come out of this, is the information, people understanding these issues about zoning and ADUs and autonomous vehicles. And
it all starts with a conversation.
It all starts with the knowledge. And if we're all going in blind and making rash decisions, well, nothing good is ever going to come out of that.
Yeah.
So I think the good news is you do have a shift in the younger generations. There's a lot of seekers. There's a lot of young kids. I know Tyler's one. They're always looking on the internet for information, right?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is there are solutions out there. There are best practices that Florida can engage in. And there's now an entity in Florida that's pushing for those best practices. You know, we just held the housing summit, our first one. We had 275 people show up at the housing summit. We literally had to stop registration because I was planning for a 150, and we overbooked it. We have the Florida Automated Vehicle Summit coming up in September, our 12th year running that. I ran it when I was a state senator. I started this because I wanted people to be able to see around the corner of what's going on in transportation. We've talked about AI, but AI in transportation, eVTOL, electric, shared, autonomous, all these technologies are transitioning into transportation, and nobody's really, there isn't a statewide conversation about that outside of FAV that's really occurring. So it's exciting to be able to bring those and talk about those conversations. But for me, what's exciting is like running a nonprofit for me is like methadone for the legislative process. I love taking on these tough problems. I love thinking about the public policy solutions of how do we actually solve this thing. And I explain to people, like, being in the legislative process is a little bit like the first movie of The Matrix. Like, the first choice is red pill, blue pill, right? Then you recognize, oh my gosh, I'm in the Matrix. Like, this isn't real. Tallahassee, what happens in Tallahassee, like, it's not real. Like, you're taking on a whole new set of problems that you didn't have to deal with back home, right? And then you learn all this incredibly valuable information. How do I going to deal with education policy at scale or insurance? And it's really valuable, but really only valuable in the Matrix, right? Like,
right.
But
because you sit at a dinner table and the guy across from you goes, "Okay, cool,
right?
Who gives a shit?" Anyway, then, the Bucks,
right? Yeah, let's talk the Bucks. I don't want to talk about insurance policy.
Right.
I don't want to talk about affordable. Like, I don't have context for that conversation. And then by the end, you're 8-10 years in. I did 12 years in the legislature. I can see the zeros and ones. Like, I can dodge the bullets. I know what, when I got in trouble in Tallahassee, I knew exactly what's going to happen to me. I still got in trouble. I still did what I thought was right, but I knew exactly what the ramifications were for that decision. And I can see today, like, where this is playing out. Like, I can tell you how it's going to have to be before the legislature is going to happen, like before the legislature is going to act on this stuff. And it's a wonderful and it's a terrifying place to be.
Yeah.
Because I can see, I know where this is going, and I know how this is likely to play out. But I also know there are real solutions out there, and I'm just blessed to be able to work on this stuff day in and day out and talk about it. It's a lot of fun.
What did you say? It's a crazy place to be. Say that quote one more time. What was it?
About
you were like, I think you were saying it's a wild place to be. Oh, I forgot it. I was going to say that'd be a good slogan for Florida.
Right.
Anyway, well, this has been incredible. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for me.
I just want to say, lastly, though, we've talked a lot of doom and gloom, and you did say there's policy, there's solutions out there. Do you believe we can get ahead of this? Do you believe that there's changes that can be made?
I think we have a very short window of time on housing
Yeah.
to get in to begin to change the incentives before the wave crashes on us. Right, like the tsunami is coming. We're probably not going to get it. We're definitely not going to get it perfect. But we have a very short window to begin to change the incentives before we are California. On the insurance front, things are getting better. Those changes that the legislature made in 2022 that went into effect in 2023, we're about 14, 15 months into that. We are seeing that world improve, and I do think it's going to get better. Rates have pretty much leveled off right now. I think we've hit the high water mark in property insurance rates, at least for homeowners right now. Things are going to get better. The prison system is going to get worse before it gets better. I mean, unfortunately, if we look around the country, the catalyst that has changed things in most prison states, in most states' prison system, has been something horrible has happened. And I don't want to go into what all the horrible things that have happened. I'll just tell you that the former Secretary of Department of Corrections gave out this book called The Devil's Butcher Shop that talked about some prison riots that ultimately sparked change and drove some of the changes. But like terrible things typically are would have happened that have sparked cities and states to change, or the federal government's come over and take over your prison system. And on transportation, I think it's enough to know the trajectory, and we can build around it. We already see developers building around it. We have to get honest about what the future looks like in transportation, and like Wayne Gretzky skate to where the puck's going to be, not to where the puck is today.
Exactly.
Right. We need to be focusing on the future. And that's why these conversations are so important, and understanding where the future is going. These are things we know. These are things that we should be able to know, and it's exciting.
Absolutely. Jeff Brandes, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much.
I appreciate it. How can people find you real quick?
Yeah, go to floridapolicyproject.com, and we're there. And I live in St. Pete, so
get involved.
I'm around, and I speak quite a bit and travel the state. So I'm honored to be back home. And I love working on hard problems like this. So thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. All right. See you next week. Bye, everybody. Thank you guys for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like it. Check us out on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel. Give us a comment. Give us some feedback. We want to know how we're doing. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.